Awesome. All right. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about servers. We're going to be talking about servers, Python servers specifically, because we will be building all of our backend functionality with Python languages and Python frameworks. So today, we're going to be talking about the full stack development process. We'll get a real quick review. Then after that, we'll look at the real life example of what an API would do, what kind of responses it would return. Then we'll talk about installing Flask, creating a function that will return all of the students, starting that Flask server. After that, we'll run the server and understand how the server is actually running. Then we'll go over creating an API route, how to JSONify our query set that comes back from the database, or how to JSONify our information before sending it over HTTP request. I apologize. And then during part 2 of our lecture, we'll cover how to connect Postgres to Flask. What is Psycopg3? We'll talk about creating the student class model to actually work with Flask and Postgres. And then we'll talk about Python queries and how to format query sets before sending requests. Does anyone have any questions over what will be taught today? All right, if there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and start. All right. The first thing we're going to be covering here is going to be the full stack development process. We talked about this the other day, shortly. We talked about our front-end application, which we'll be utilizing with HTML and CSS, and we're already starting to learn a little bit about that. Tomorrow, we're going to learn about how to utilize JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, and the DOM is a document object model structure, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Today, we're going to be talking about the Flask server. But before we start getting into that, yesterday we covered our SQL database and how databases are created, how to write queries that will actually grab information from the database. So currently we could create a front end for the student class that we've been working with, or the student data that we've been working with so far. We could create an HTML template that says, hey, welcome, this is our school. Is there a specific student that you're looking for, or here are the students, right? And we have a CSV file that has all of our student data, and we know that we can save that student data within Postgres before we actually go and deploy our application. But how do we get these two to talk to each other? All right, how does my front end communicate to the database? Well, my front end never directly communicates to the database. It directly communicates to my backend server. And my backend server will be in charge of accepting requests from my front end. JavaScript will send requests to the server saying, hey, I need this information. The server will take that request. It'll see if it's something that it's doable or not, or if it's an acceptable request. If it is, it'll run whatever logic is corresponding to the endpoint or the request that was sent. So in this case, we can see that we're getting HTTPS www.facebook.com. That's just Facebook. But this /all post here on the right-hand side is what the server is just going to pick up. The server is going to pick up this all post and identify it as an endpoint. And endpoints are something that we ourselves as developers can define, set, but we just need to make sure that we follow a specific rules when it comes to making these endpoints. In the development process, although we have the ability to name them however we want, there's a specific standard that has been set by the community that we must follow. Now, we have a whole book that talks about these standards and naming conventions that you can read about it. It's all linked inside of your student resources, and I believe it was part of the pre-read last night. All right, so now that we talked about this endpoint, our server's going to say, all right, well, I know that all post is supposed to trigger a specific function. So it finds the function that corresponds to all post, and it says, all right, well, when I receive this all post, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Oh, I'm supposed to grab all of the posts that belong to this one user who sent the request and return it in a JSON format. So now it says, all right, well, since I have to grab all of the posts that belong to this one user, I need to grab that from the database. So our server, although written in Python, we'll see later on how it will turn this database query into a Python-based query where it will ask for all of the posts belonging to this one user, and the friends are also located in there. Well, the database will take that information, it'll spit out a database query, and that query is something that we'll reference to as a query set. That query set is going to come in kind of as if it was OOP. It's going to come in looking something like this. It's going to say query set, and it'll have a list of different objects inside of it, all of which will occupy a memory space. Can't remember off the top of my head if this is exactly how it looks, but it comes looking somewhere around those lines. Well, a query set isn't something that's JSON readable or something that I can actually work with. So my server is going to grab that query set, turn it into JSON by utilizing that JSONify library, which we spoke about in the overview. And then once it turns it into JSON or formats it inside of a JSON format, then it's going to return that query set to the front end looking like this example. It grabs that query set and it makes sure that every object within that query set looks like this. And then from there, JavaScript will grab this information and render content for our user in the front end. Does anyone have any questions about the full stack live process? Okay, if no one has any questions, let's go ahead and take a look at a real life example here. I'm a huge Pokemon fan, so I like using the PokeAPI for this real life example, but we'll take a look at a couple of others later on. Now, this PokeAPI, as we talked about earlier, oh, wow. There you go. All right, this PokeAPI, like we talked about earlier, it's going to actually go ahead and we can see that the actual URL is pokeapi.co. But then it tells me, hey, we have an API that you can work with. And I know that I'm interacting with an API because of this /API. After this slash, this is what actually takes me to the website and what the browser actually needs in order to be able to render information. Everything else after that, a developer dictated that this is the way it's going to be named. So this URL is telling me this is an API endpoint. Not only is it an API endpoint, but it's telling me that I am now communicating with version 2 of their API. Now, it sets that as default because it's telling me that all my API calls should be to version 2. And that's going to be constant across the entire API. All right. Here are the variables that I can manipulate. It tells me I can look for Pokemon, and I can specify which Pokemon if I would like. So currently right now it's looking for Ditto. If I wanted to look something more popular, everyone knows Charizard. So let's look for Charizard real quick. All right, and it gives me all the information regarding Charizard. So it runs a query to the database. Right, this submit button sends a get request over to the server. The server says, okay, I know this endpoint is acceptable. This is an acceptable endpoint. So now I'm going to go ahead and run my functionality. It grabs Charizard and it queries the database, select all, where Pokemon.name is equal to Charizard. And then it returns Charizard as all of the information regarding to Charizard. Well, that comes back as a query set. Then after that, the server just formats it so that it looks like something that's JSON readable. And now this information in JSON can be sent through HTTP request or HTTP responses. Now they made it look all nice and pretty for me, but if I wanted to see what it actually looks like, it even tells me the size that it's going to be taking upon the request. Well, if I wanted to see what it's actually look like or its true format, this is what it comes back as. We can see that it's just objects nested within other objects and a huge list with objects at times. All right. Let's see what other endpoints they have. Well, what happens if I just send a request to Pokemon? Well, if I just send a request to Pokemon, it's going to tell me the total count of Pokemon there is, right? I didn't specify the Pokemon afterwards, so it triggered this endpoint instead, where I'm just looking for a general Pokemon. And then it tells me, all right, well, if you wanted to look at each Pokemon at a time, you could look at 20 Pokemon at a time. All right, so it tells me version 2, I'm looking at Pokemon. Not only am I looking at Pokemon, but I want to only see 20. I want it to offset by 20 and give me a limit of 20. So it's giving me this offset 20 because it gave me the first 20 responses. And it gives me next and previous. So if I wanted to see the next 20, I can go to this URL. And if I wanted to see the previous 20, well, that would be provided down here later on. And we can see that it just gives me a name and the URL for the specific Pokemon. Well, now it's not giving me a Pokemon by name. It's giving me a Pokemon by a integer. What do we think this integer could possibly represent inside of the database?
ID.
Awesome. Yeah, this is actually representing the ID of an individual Pokemon. So if we take a look, here's Charizard. I looked him up earlier by the string of Charizard, but it tells me that I can also look him up through the ID of 6. So the programmer that created this API endpoint said, we are going to accept either the name of the Pokemon or the ID of the Pokemon and still be able to find it within our database and return that data. And they handle that within their function. All right. I think that's going to be it as far as a real life example. I don't want to dig too far into this before we actually start creating our own API. So at this point, does anyone have any questions about the PokeAPI? Okay, I see someone's typing on the chat, so I'm going to give it a couple seconds here. All right. So in the chat, we have a question saying we are taking tabular structured data from Postgres and returning it to the user in JSON. Why would we skip JSONify library and not use a NoSQL database? Okay, that's a great question. So when it comes to NoSQL databases, so when you utilize a NoSQL database, and this might be a bit of a rabbit hole, they're already inside of JSON format, right? Because they're working, how do I explain this? They're already within a JSON format. So the benefit isn't necessarily being able to skip JSONifying the data structure. The benefit between SQL and NoSQL databases comes as far as how are you saving your data? How is that data being managed? And how that data is being returned. Landon, I think you're asking this question because you have experience with NoSQL databases. I may be wrong on that, but NoSQL databases typically are they're and I may be wrong here, but from what I gathered, they're not the best at data consistency and ensuring that data is being inputted into the database correctly. But I may be completely wrong there. I don't have much experience with NoSQL databases. I have used SQL-oriented databases.
You are right on the money.
Okay,
You
perfect.
don't get, yeah, with NoSQL databases, you don't get the same level of structure and like guarantees around data integrity that you get with most relational databases, both from the tables. Also, like the rich query language of SQL is really powerful, and relational databases do some stuff with transactions and like guaranteeing that something either succeeds or fails and doesn't end up in a weird halfway state that not is less common with NoSQL databases.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. Does that answer your question, Landon?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Francisco and Adam. It was after the readings from like some of the pros I saw from the SQL databases about how to manage like locking when you're doing calls, and I just didn't know if NoSQL databases didn't have that same style lock because it's already in JSON format and it's just like looking up keys or adding key values. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Of course. Yeah, no problem. I see another question coming in, so let's give it a couple more seconds. All right, this may be another rabbit hole, but I have been looking at different APIs and I keep seeing something about SDKs. Yeah, that one we'll definitely cover later on. When it comes to SDKs, I believe that's talking about a different framework. We'll cover that later on, but definitely a good question. Okay, moving on. Let's actually start creating our Flask server. Let's start talking about how to install Flask and how to create a specific function that will return all students. All right. So here we have our app.py. And inside of app.py, we already have, oh, was it option Z? There you go. We already have some students. We can see the dictionary, and we can see this is the same exact dictionary, or these dictionaries represent the same exact students that we had in our CSV file earlier. Well, this data is good to have on this application, but later on, we're going to be getting this data from our database. Starting off with Flask, the way we're going to install Flask is I'm going to go ahead and say pip install Flask with a capital F. For me, it's going to tell me that the requirements are already satisfied. For all of you, this might take a minute for pip to actually install Flask. If you do not have the latest version of pip, please upgrade your pip and then install Flask. You typically want to do your installments with the latest version of your install package. So make sure that you always have the latest version. All right. So now I have Flask and I have this list named students. Let's make something simple. How do I make a function that will return this list of students? And it's not a trick question. Go ahead, Ryan.
We could call it def get all students or something. And I mean, this is just a regular function, so there would be no self or anything to pass in because there's no class. There'd be no arguments, and then just return students.
Awesome. So it has the students variable, it gets called, and it's able to return the students. Okay, well, let's make sure that this function works. Let's print get all students, and let's actually run this function. So now I'm going to utilize Python to run my app.py. Okay, so the function works. Right? We made a function that can get all of the students or the list of all students and return them. And currently it's printing to my terminal. Well, that's good news for me as a developer or me if I'm working on a specific Python script. But currently I want this information to be accessible to my front end as well. All right, I want to be able to accept requests and send this information to some sort of front end or some sort of third party that's trying to grab this information. Well, how do I turn this function into an actual server? Let's start talking about creating a Flask server. We're going to actually import Flask. So I'm going to say import Flask. And I apologize, that's the wrong place. I'm going to have to specify that from Flask, I want to import Flask. Okay. So now I imported Flask. Flask has a capital F, and if I hover over it, it tells me that it's a class. And then it tells me, all right, well, in the init, it doesn't seem like I need to pass any folders into the init or pass any arguments into the init. Well, let's take a look in the initialization, or let's take a look at this class. If you're on Mac, you can do something like command and then click on the class itself. If you're on WSL, I believe control will do the same thing for you. Okay, so now when I click on Flask, it opens up class Flask. And it tells me a little bit about Flask. I'm not going to necessarily read all of this, but I'm going to take a look at their example. All right, so here it gives me an example and it tells me, hey, you can import Flask this way. And after you import it, you can start the actual Flask application by doing a variable named app. I can name it whatever I want. It doesn't have to be named app. And I can make that equal to the instance of the class. Now I have this underscore name being placed in here. Whenever you see this, this is in reference to the name of the file. Underscore name underscore will always reference to the name of the file that you are currently on. It's just a placeholder if you want to be lazy, and rather than typing the name of the file in there, you can just name it name. All right. Well, that tells me a little bit about Flask. I don't necessarily need to read all of this, but if you're interested, please go ahead and take a deeper look. But here's a little bit of default configuration, things that I can change whenever I make my instance or whenever Flask is running, right? And it tells me this is an immutable dictionary. So that means that once Flask starts, I can't change it. If I want to change it, I have to stop Flask, change the variable, and then run this information so that the dictionary can then get processed with the new information. Well, I can see this debug part, and it's equal to none. Well, debug can be set to true or false, which allows us as developers to see some sort of error message whenever we make a mistake. Well, we want that debug to be true while it's in development because we want to be able to get good error messages where it tells me, hey, you probably made a mistake on this line. You could adjust it and it gives me a hint of where I could have made a wrong turn. Would I want that debug to still be on whenever it goes into production?
No.
Yeah, awesome. I would want that debug to be off so that my clients won't get those messages, and instead they'll see a message from that I dictate, right? I'll put something on there that says, hey, this doesn't exist. For example, we go to github.com and I go into GitHub and I do something like slash does it exist? And I go into it. Well, it's going to try to go into Code Platoon assessments and say, well, does it exist? And we can see that this obviously isn't a repository that lives inside of Code Platoon assessments. So when this goes to the server, it returns an error. And then the front end application of GitHub says, okay, well, since this returned an error, rather than showing me the default error or whatever it is that comes back from what they use to develop their front end, they set up an error page for something that doesn't exist. So every time that a 404 returns from the server, this page gets rendered through their front end application to tell me, hey, this web page that you're looking for, we can't find it, and it's a 404. All right. So now you know a little bit about how it's working in the background. Let's go ahead and start this application. I'm going to actually follow their example that they passed on here. I'm going to go ahead and name it app, and I'm going to name that equal to an instance of Flask that carries the underscore name variable. If you hover over name, it's going to tell you this is static, doesn't mean anything. It's just having app as Flask underscore name. All right. So now I have my list of students here. I have my application named app. So how do I actually run this app here. There's a function at the very bottom that we can trigger at the very bottom of our script. So once all of our logic gets executed and everything in our app gets built, then we want to run our function. So I'm going to tell my app instance of Flask to run. So now app.run, what does this .run mean? If I'm accessing .run or I'm accessing run through .run, that tells me that run is what? In reference to the class.
Class method.
Yeah, that's close. It's actually an instance method, right? Because we made an instance of Flask. And by making an instance of this Flask application, now we can run a server. And this is where I can tell it, well, before you start running the server, and it gives me a little bit of hints here. It tells me that I can specify the host where I want it to run. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let it choose its default value. Or I can give it none. So that's where that this hard line is coming from. It's giving me or. So I can either give it a host or I could not give it a host. I could specify a port. And for a port, it's requiring that I give it an integer. Or I could not provide anything. And I could also give it debug, which is expecting a Boolean value, or I could not provide anything. And then it gives me this load.env, which we'll talk about environmental variables later on, how to hide them and utilize them. But currently, this is something that we don't necessarily have to worry about. So let's run it. Let's go ahead and make our debug equal to true, because I want to make sure that I'm able to see my error messages. Well, I wonder what happens when I execute my function now. So now I'm going to go ahead and execute the server. All right, what is this telling me? Let's take a look. So I get my first print statement that comes in from my script. Right, it's executing from top to bottom. So I see that I have this print statement happening here. And then it hits app.run. All right, so serving Flask app with the name of app. That's because I named it app.py. So the Flask app is now running. Its debug mode is on because I gave it true. Then it gives me this warning saying, hey, this is not for development. Do not use this in production. You need a WSGI server to be able to actually host this. We'll talk about WSGI later on once we go into our production week. But essentially, this is telling us that this server is not fit for production. I need to utilize a different server. This is only for local development. Okay, no problem. That's all I need it for. I just need it for local development so far. Then it tells me that we're running. This is running my application at http://127.0.0.1. We've talked a little bit about this before. What is this 127.0.0.1?
Localhost.
Yeah, it's representing my local host, my actual machine, right? It's saying within this machine, and what is this? My port. Awesome. So this is saying within this machine, I'm going to occupy port 5000, and this is where we're running. And now it's saying restarting with stat. And that's why I get that print statement multiple times. It's running this entire script all over again to make sure that everything was written correctly. It was written correctly, so now it gives me debugger is active, letting me know that it's active. And that my pin, if my debugger asks me for a pin, it is 773.196.617. Okay, great. Well, let's see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and press Command and then click on this URL that it provided me. Okay, it opened it up on a separate window, so I'm going to go ahead and drag it over here. Okay. We get a not found error. I never made an HTML template that says not found. I never made a paragraph tag or something along the lines that says not found. Let's inspect it. Let's see what's going on here. Take out the body, I have an H1 and a paragraph tag that says not found. Okay. Where's this coming from? Where's this HTML coming from? Go ahead, Brian.
Is it coming from your server because it doesn't like have any route that you gave it to connect this data to?
Awesome. Yeah, it's actually coming from my server. So my server, I can take a look here. This was the last line that I received before. But now let's take a look at this. So now it's saying that it received a request that went to localhost. This request was a GET request. It was sent over HTTP, but it doesn't have an endpoint to respond to this request. So it returned a 404. And here we see it trying to get something else again. Maybe it tried the request twice, and it just returned a 404. Well, let's take a look at what's happening inside of our browser. Inside of our browser, we can take a look at the network tab. And within the network tab, if I go to refresh this, we can see that a couple of lines have populated. Currently, there's nothing happening. Rough. Not able to show it up correctly. Let me see if I can take a look here. There it is. All right. I apologize. I had some things clicked that weren't supposed to be clicked. We can see here that inside of my network tab, while the browser was running, it sent a request to localhost, but it came back with a status 404. And then it came back with a document. Well, if I take a look at the request, I look at and I could take a look at the headers here. Go ahead and open this up. It tells me I sent a request to 127 at port 5000. It was a GET request. That request came back with a status not found. The response header was close. It came back with some content length. And here's the content type. So we can see that it returned HTML as text. And it may even allow me to see the body. There you go. So this is what my server is returning by default to my actual application. This is all coming from within the Flask server. Even though I didn't write it, Flask as a framework has some sort of class or class method or instance method inside of it that knows that when it gets sent a request that it's not accounting for, that it should return this template as a response. All right, does anyone have any questions over how Flask is handling errors? Or how we got this HTML template to show up within our browser?
I have one just regarding the Dunder name, Dunder main stuff.
Yeah, go ahead, Luis.
So when you started it, you said that Flask Dunder name is equal to app, and your file name is app.py. So what do you need the at the bottom of this? What do you need the app.run debug equals true portion for if you're already like calling this instantiation of Flask app?
Got it. So I made the instance of Flask, right? But by making the instance of Flask, that doesn't actually execute my my server. It doesn't run the server. If I comment that app.runout and I run it, it just reads it as a regular Python script. This right here is what actually runs my development server. So I am running this method, which is an instance method, to run a server with debug equals true. And that's what allows me to actually host information and send requests to that port.
That makes sense. In the I'm trying to think, like the curriculum for what we're doing right now for like what is a web server, the it has a portion where it says like if dunder name equals dunder main. Could you speak a little bit more to that, like what the significance of that portion would be?
Yeah, of course. And let me go ahead and copy that over and bring it here. Okay, so what this is saying is if __ name, which we already know is app.py, is equal to main. So when I execute this Python at app.py, main is in reference to the script itself as well. So it's going to say if these two things are equal to each other, which they will be as soon as I execute this, it is going to execute my app dot run. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now that we talked about what Flask is doing, how it's actually running my server, let's actually create a route for it. We have all this information. We're able to run an actual Python app or an actual Flask server, but it doesn't know how to actually return this information. And we already talked that the reason that it's not able to return this information is because it doesn't have a route just yet. Well, Flask is very simple as far as creating routes. All we need to do is add a decorator that will reference our app class. And we're going to specify, hey, this is going to be a route, or this function below will be triggered when a route comes in. Now this route, we know that this is an API. So I'm going to specify this should be talking to API. I'm going to specify the version. So this is version 1. And then after that, I'm going to give it a pluralized thing that I'm looking for. So in this case, what I'm looking for is students. And that's going to end my endpoint. I am pinging my API. This is the very first version of it, and it is going to students. Okay. So now that we know this is going to students, I can specify what kind of methods can come into this request. So we'll talk more about methods later on, but there is 4 types of methods. There's going to be get, put, delete. So we can see get, put, delete, or post. And think about these methods being relatable to what's happening in your database. So let's go ahead and break that down. Again, we'll go over these in more detail later on, but I'm just going to do a quick breakdown of them so that we can actually know what they're doing and we can identify what we should have here. So get should be for grabbing information. Put should be for updating info within the database. Delete should be for deleting an entry within the DB. And post should be for creating an entry to the database. All right, so these are the type of requests that we'll be working with. This is going to break into CRUD, but we'll go over this a lot more once we actually start working with Django. So now that I know I got this quick intro to the methods, what kind of method should this route accept out of these 4?
Would it be get?
All right, perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and specify the method. Oh. And that's going to take in a list of methods, which in this case, we know should be get. And just like that, we created a route. We are saying that when our API pings API/v1 students, it's going to grab this function and return the student list. Well, let's see what happens then. I'm going to go ahead and run this Python app. Looks like I got an unexpected argument that's being passed into the rule set. I named it method, which is singular, and I want it to be able to accept multiple types of methods. Okay, so I passed it, and now it's telling me, all right, well, now you messed something up. Your URL rule must start with a slash. Okay. Again, we add a slash at the beginning. Let's run that app. And finally, we get that app running. So we can see that it's pretty user-friendly. It's telling me where my error is coming from, and it's trying to guide me towards the correct answer to be able to run my server correctly. Well, now let me refresh the page here. When I refresh the page at 127.0.0.1 at port 5000, it's still giving me a 404 error. Well, that's what I expected because there's no URL endpoint accounting for that. So how do I trigger this function to get all the students?
Yeah, would you have to add that that endpoint, that app.route, the string you specified into the URI?
All right, let's try that out. Let's go to API/v1/students. Okay, so now when I send that request, we can see that it was successful. We can take a look at the network tab. Let me go ahead and open this up. So the network tab, send it to students. Let's take a look at the headers. The request URL went to HTTP API/v1. It was a GET request. It is now a 200 OK. So the status code came back with, hey, this was a successful request. And if I take a look at the response now, my response is my list of dictionaries, but now it's in JavaScript because remember, JavaScript is the language of the web. So now it's not a list of dictionaries, but rather an array of objects that I can manipulate with JavaScript once it's returned to the front end. And just like that, we built an API route that can actually return a list of students. We're creating a web server that's able to render information from within our script. All right, let's take a look at the questions that we have on the channel right now. We can see, can you explain the first argument being passed into the app route? What exactly is supposed to go in there? Of course. So the very first argument that goes into app route, let's actually open up route here. Maybe it'll give us a little bit of information. And what about option Z here? Okay. So this is a method. It's a setup method. And we're telling it that this is going to be a route. Well, the very first argument that it takes is the rule, which is supposed to be a string. And then after that, it goes into different options. All right, so we can see that it's a decorator, and it's supposed to be utilized to decorate a function so that it can return a route. And it gives us an example. So here it says that at app route slash, meaning that at the slash, it's supposed to say hello world. Well, let's copy that over. I'm going to take it. I'm going to place that right up here. Oh. So now I also have a route that's named index that is supposed to be triggered at slash. This first argument is just the URL that's to follow, or the URL that's supposed to trigger this function. So if I run my app now, and I go back to 127.0.0.1 at port 5000, and all I do is I put an ending slash in there, it's going to show hello world. And that's because that is all that I'm returning within this string. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
I think that like made me have like two more questions.
Yeah, of course.
So the first one, so it has app.route. Do we always use app.route even if, because you said at the beginning of the file, we could name it whatever, right? Or should it always be app.route or should it be whatever we name it at the top?
Yeah, so this is a variable. We could change the name of
Yeah.
it. So if I were to, yeah, I think those are all my app instances. If I were to change this to one else, second app, and I control C this and I run it, all of them are called second app, right? So this is second app is just a variable in reference to the instance. And I'm saying for the instance of this app, I am naming a route. All right, so that's
Okay.
what you get hello world. It's just a variable. Whatever it is that you named it up here is how you can access its attributes.
Okay, perfect. And then the other question is, so in the route parentheses, you're basically making that URL into whatever you want to name it, but I assume there's like conventions for how you should name stuff, right?
Yeah, so there's a naming convention as to how we should name it. The specific convention would be that if it's an API, you should always start it by specifying the API and the version. And then after that, your endpoint should always be pluralized and to reference to a noun. So if I am grabbing students, I'm going to say this is all students. And if I was just grabbing one student, then I would follow it here by passing something like ID. And then I could specify that it's an integer. And then this way, somebody could give me a student ID to grab something out of the database.
Got it. Okay, yeah, I was just confused like where you got that like chunk of a URL from, but I guess you're making it depending on the naming conventions.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right. If there aren't any other questions, we're going to go ahead and take a break and start working on that morning assignment for today. So that morning assignment is going to be creating a simple server with Flask. And we're going to go ahead and take the next 30 minutes. Let's make it 45 minutes to go ahead and tackle that assignment. Currently, right now, it is 9:55. We'll gather back up here at 10:40 to continue on with the second part of our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we left for a break, we were actually able to get an HTTP request to our Flask server that would request for either an index or for a number of students. So if we take a look at our HTTP, our URL can send it to API version 1 students. And now we can see how we receive all of this information here. We get every single student within an array of objects on our browser side, even though on our server side, it is a list of dictionaries. All right. So this is great, but this isn't actually a full stack application, right? This isn't actually letting me talk or communicate to my database at all. Rather than returning students, well, I would want students to be redefined. So what I really want to happen is I want to run a query that says select all from students. And I want this query to be executed within the SQL database. So I'm going to go ahead and open up another terminal here. I'm going to actually place these terminals side by side. One terminal will be running my server. The other one I'm going to utilize to interact with PSQL. All right, so I named my database students. And if I run that query now, select all from students, it returns to me a data table for all of the students with their individual information. Returns me their ID, first and last name, along with their age and grade. And I can see that it returns 5 rows for 5 individual items. Well, rather than getting a data table to show up in my terminal, I want to actually tell Flask how to communicate with this database that's living within my machine. So let's break that down. How can I do that? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab SQLAlquemy. So I'm going to go ahead and say pip. Is there a question? I apologize. I think I heard a mic here. All right, doesn't seem like there were any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and keep going forward. I'm going to run pip install capital F for Flask dash SQLAlquemy. And this is what Flask needs in order to be able to communicate through SQL queries. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. Looks like I forgot to put a space between pip and install, so I'm going to place a space bar there. Okay, so for me, all the requirements had already been satisfied. For you, this might take a while to actually get installed. All right, but now that I have that installed, I can actually utilize it to speak to my server. Well, this is something that Flask is going to need to be able to run SQL queries. But how do I get Python to communicate with SQL? How do I get Python to write SQL queries? Well, that's where I'm going to utilize something called PsycopG. So this is PsycopG. They talk about their different installation procedures, but essentially PsycopG is something that works with Python to be able to run SQL queries. So now I'm going to go ahead and install that as well. And all of this is doing is opening up my ability to communicate to my database. And let's go ahead and take a small section so far before we actually start going into creating our SQL schema to answer some questions. I see 2 of them are on the chat. One says, how did you initialize the database with student info? I did not initialize the database with student info. We have student info there from yesterday's lecture. If you don't currently have student info in there, you can run your SQL script that we wrote yesterday to be able to get some students in there. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Of course. All right, then we got a question from Tom. Is this where we would want to start using other Python virtual environments and freezing specific dependencies within our projects? Yeah, we'll go into that later on, but essentially each individual project should keep track of its dependencies. First, we'll get introduced into node package modules. Working with NPM, you'll see how that keeps track of the packages that you're utilizing to be able to create your project. And in Python, we'll have to utilize virtual environments to be able to keep track of what we need to be able to run that one project. We don't want too many things, but at this point, we're not quite there yet. We'll see that more in depth once we start working into our individual frameworks. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now I got this SQL schema. I was able to install it. I was also able to install PsycopG binary so that I can actually speak to my database with Python and Flask. Well, let's start this out. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say from Flask _ SQLAlquemy, because that's what I'm going to be using here to be able to speak to the database. I want to import SQLAlquemy. Well, SQLAlquemy needs to know who it is that it's going to relate to. But before we can figure out who it's going to relate to, I need to figure out which database is it going to attach to. So I'm going to tell my app how to speak or find this database. So I'm going to go into the configuration of my application, and I'm going to specify that utilizing SQLAlquemy, I want you to connect to the following database that is within this URI. So utilizing SQLAlquemy, find the database that is within this address. Okay, well now what address are we talking about? Postgres is living within my machine, and I'm utilizing Postgres. So I'm going to go ahead and specify I want you to use PostgreSQL as our default database. And now it's going to ask for the username and password. So who's the username of this machine? Well, the username would be myself. So I'm going to go ahead and put Francisco Avila because that's the name that I have on my computer. It's not showing it to me here, but oh, here it is. Francisco Avila. That's my name in my computer. So I'm running Francisco Avila. I do not have a password within Postgres, but if you do have a password, you would do colon and then type in your password here. I don't have one, so I don't need to do that. And then the next thing I need to specify is where can I find this machine? I understand that it's a PostgreSQL database. I see that I have the username and password, but where is it located? Well, here I would specify an actual URL if it was a deployed database, along with a port or some sort of information as to where the database is actually running. But in this case, I'm going to tell it that it's within my local host. All right, it's running inside of my own machine. And inside of my own machine, the database that I wanted to connect to is the database named students. All right, now let's make sure that my application is still able to run. Nothing has really changed. It should run. All right, so everything was able to run. Nothing changed just yet. All right. So now I was able to connect it to a database, but I'm not doing anything. All right, it doesn't know how it's supposed to do that or what it is that it's supposed to do with the database. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually link the database to our application and be able to talk to it. Well, I told my app that it will utilize SQLAlquemy to talk to this information. Well, now that I gave that to my configuration, now SQLAlquemy can come in action. So I can say that my database is equal to SQLAlquemy, and I can pass in my app. So what this is going to do is it's going to go inside of my application that I've created. It's going to find the header or the configuration that says SQLAlquemy database URI, and it's going to link to this database and return that database value over to DB. So now I can use DB to reference the database every time I need it. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about how we linked our database to our Flask server? At this point, the link has been connected. I can still run it. Nothing is necessarily going to change, but I know that I haven't made a mistake because it didn't throw an error. Go ahead, Jens.
The password there, that's specific to Postgres, and it's not the like a pseudo password that we made in InstallFast.
Yes, so that password is going to be specific to Postgres, not to your machine.
Okay, so unless we specifically made one, we probably don't have a password for Postgres as well.
That's correct. Unless you
Okay.
actually gave yourself a password, you don't have one.
Okay.
All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and push forward. Well, now we learned OOP, and this is where OOP kind of takes it to the next level. The way that our database knows to identify a specific data table that we've created is it references it to a class. So if I take a look here at our students database, this is the table that we created. And it very much resembles a class. Well, now we're going to turn this create table into a class that we can identify within Python. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to make our class, and it's going to be named student. I understand that it is named students here. So it's actually going to be named students here as well, because that is the name of my table. And I'm going to say this is a DB model. So what I'm telling is this right here, what I'm creating is a model. And what it's actually going to turn into inside of the database is into a data table. But this is just a model in which Python is going to interpret the information coming back from the database into the class. Okay, so with that said, I want to make sure that I resemble everything that I made on the right-hand side. I want to make sure that I have an ID, which is going to be equal to db dot column. This is going to be a integer. And it will be a primary key. So this is the column that belongs to the model. It is going to be an ID. It is an integer, and it is true for primary key. So knowing that, when I make the first name, it is also going to be a column. And the data type will be a string, which will be 10. That's what we gave it here on the right-hand side. It's going to be a character count up to 10. Then we have our last name, which is also a column with a string up to 10. Finally, we have an integer, or sorry, an age, which is also a column. I can specify that it's an integer. And I can also specify, oh, actually, that's all that I need to do. It is an integer. I could give it a min and max, but that's not the current thing that we're covering right now. And then finally, we have our grade, which is also a string with a max value of 1. And just like that, we made this data table as a class that we can reference into utilizing Python. Does anyone have any questions over how I created this class student? Go ahead, Will.
So basically, since it's inheriting from the db.model, it doesn't need like an init function or anything.
Yeah, so this right here won't actually have an initializer. It's taking this as our init arguments. These are going to be the attributes that it would take in as if it were an init. But because it is inheriting from the db.model, its behavior is different, just like you mentioned. Does that answer your question, Will?
Yeah, thanks.
Of course. Any other questions? Go ahead, Tyler.
Could you just go over again real quick, like what the db.model like actually does?
Yeah, definitely. So DB is in reference to the database that we're connected to. So we're connected to this database named students, okay? And it's inside of our local host. But I want to create a table. Rather than creating a table, I am referencing a table as a model. And what this is saying is, hey, whenever I'm communicating to the database, this is the model that we'll use as kind of a translator to communicate. So rather than saying from students select all grade, or select from students get grade, or from select grade from students, I can say select grade or students.grade, and it's able to grab that information and spit it out as if it were Python code. I'm just telling Python, giving it kind of a dictionary to translate its Python code into SQL queries or SQL
Okay.
query results.
So there is some like magic under the hood with SQLAlquemy and everything.
Yes, there is. The communication between the two happens with Psycopg.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. So now I have all of these students and I have all of this information and I'm able to talk to my database finally. Let's make sure that it runs correctly. What happens when I run my app? Okay, I'm able to run my app and I don't have any additional information coming in. Okay. Well, now instead of grabbing students from this list here, how do I select students in my array? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually send a query to my database. And I'm going to do that by accessing the class named students. So just like I have from students here, I'm going to say students, which is the data table that I've selected, dot query, which tells it, hey, this is a query. This is going to SQL and I want to grab something, dot all. So I want to grab all the information from all of the students within the students table. Let's take a look at what that looks like here. Let's print students. And before we actually return this as a value, let's have students for now. Let me go ahead and refresh this. No, it's telling me that it doesn't exist, which is true. I'm not running my server. Okay, so I can see that it returns students, but now let's take a look here. What does this look like? That's just OOP, right? But it's not giving me memory addresses. It's giving me a query set, a representation of the class instance within students. When I wonder if it's going to let me just return students. Let's see what happens when I send this request. Well, when I send this request, it tells me, hey, the object that you're trying to send, it has a students class, but that's not something that's JSON serializable. I can't work with that. Why would you try to send something like that? Okay, well now let's see what happens. Let's turn this back into a string. And let's see what happens when I utilize something called JSONify. I'm going to go ahead and bring in JSONify and see what it does. Right now, when I print students, I'm going to go ahead and Control-C my server. When I print students, oh, there you go. We can see that it's printing this list of students. Well, now let's see what happens when I do JSONify. Okay, my syntax error is now gone. I'm able to run it. Well, if I refresh it, it tells me, hey, you can't utilize JSONify with something that's still not JSON serializable. This is something that I can't interpret into JSON. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say JSON students. And I'm going to do it manually for now. But later, once we start working with Django, we're going to learn about something called serializers and how to turn things into serialized data. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I want to have a dictionary that will have the ID of student.id. I also wanted to have the key of first name, where student.firstname is located. I wanted to have a last name for student.lastname. I wanted to have the age for student.age. And finally, I wanted to have the grade for student.grade. And I'm just going to utilize list comprehension here. And let's take a look at the different ones here. So let's print students. And let's print JSON students. So now let's go ahead and refresh this. Nope, got to run this again. So it sends my request. My request triggers this function. And I no longer need my SQL terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that so that we can see a better output here. Okay, so we see our first print statement happening with the students class. But then after that, our second print statement actually has some objects. And we can see how it's able to grab everything out of the database through dot, etc. Look at that. We have all the information from the database. The only weird thing that we should notice here is how first name, when it comes through, it still occupies 10 characters. We can see that it's expecting it to occupy 10 characters, even though it doesn't. Okay, well now what happens if I do JSONify? When I run that to my students. Okay, so we see the very first print statement here going through. And when I utilize JSONify, it changes its value. Let's go ahead and see something like JSONify. Let's try to send this one more time, just to make sure that we're looking at the right thing. All right, so we can see that the first one sends it through. We see the first print statement, but now when I utilize JSONify, it changes that JSON students into an actual response. So it has a response that's 200 okay, meaning there's no error in it. It's actually able to turn into a JSON object. And let's take a look at JSONify and what we can do with this. So JSONify takes in an argument from Flask. We can see that there's a couple of different providers that I can do to this. Oh, I was hoping that it would show us a little more than what it's currently showing us. I apologize, everyone. Let me take a look here. All right, it's not giving us the information that I wanted it to go. And to avoid for us going any deeper than what we need to, we're going to keep this information here, right? So it's able to give me that information now. I should be able to do something like dot body, but I'm not sure if that will work. Let's go ahead and take a look here. Yeah, so it looks like it's not letting me access that attribute this way. So let's go ahead and set our students now. Or I will create this response. And let's go ahead and print response dot content. And I wonder if that one will work. Let me run my app one more time, refresh this. It won't give me the attribute name content. All right. Well, we can see that the response is going to be coming back, but let's see what the response looks like on the browser once I return the response. Well, now when I return the response, we get a list of objects coming in. We can take a look at the network tab here. We can see that it happened at students. It is a 200 okay. It came in at 588 for content length. It was a JSON type response. If I take a look at the preview, it tells me what's currently being held in there. Or I can take a look at the response and see it in plain response. And just like that, I made an endpoint that belongs to my Flask server that will accept a request, a GET request, trigger a function, run a SQL query that gets interpreted into actual SQL to grab information with the model that I've utilized here up above. And then it's able to grab and churn, we're able to format that information into something that's JSON readable. We utilize JSONify to turn it into a response, and then we return that response. Does anyone have any questions regarding all of the material that has been covered today? Go ahead, Ditch.
You pointed out in the Chrome dev tool that the first and last names have the extra space on them. Is that just because you use the char instead of VarChar within the PostgreSQL or the Postgres? Or what caused the extra space there?
That's a great question. So that extra space is not actually coming from within the database. That extra space is coming because here up above, when I told it to turn into a string, I told it that it should be 10 characters. So it's accounting for 10 characters within the string. Does that answer your question, Edge?
It does, thank you.
Of course. Lewis?
Good. Yeah, so can you go back down to when we made the def for get all students? Yeah, so students equals students.query all line 36 is supposed to be the syntax for that is a little confusing, I guess, or where it comes from. Only because you said it uses query language. But wouldn't if it was using query language, it would just be like the standard like select whatever data you want from whatever table kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. So this from students right here on the right-hand side, what this is being interpreted in Python code is by just naming the model that we're referencing to. Because remember that the model is just a table, right? So I'm saying from table students, and then here's my query. I'm trying to grab information from the table of students, and I want you to grab all. So all is saying select all from students. As far as the syntax for it, we're going to see it later on once we go into Django and we'll start talking about the different types of query sets. We have a whole section that talks about how to turn all individual queries into some Python code.
Okay, got it. So it is Python specific and you just use query and then whatever after to manipulate the data.
Yes, so this is for Flask because we're utilizing SQLAlquemy, query.all. What you'll see later on in Django will be something like students.objects.all. And that's because in Django, it utilizes objects rather than query.
Okay, got it. So query is specific to Flask. That helps. Thank you.
Of course. Kara?
Just want to bounce off Edge's question from before. So you're saying that the padding in there is because of that one string, but as far as the using char in the database, that is what it does, right? You add it adds spacing, like space padding to whatever blanks you have after, like if you set the char to 10, it's still going to be like, if you have a 4-letter name, it'll add 6 spaces, whereas varchar will be variable.
Interesting. Let me go ahead and, oh, I believe you're right because I utilized char instead of varchar. Okay, so if I go to highlight this, okay, oh, it looks like it just runs continuously. That didn't really work. I wonder if there's a way to get the length. I have to do some research into that, but that sounds like it would be right. If I utilize character, it would continue using the padding, but if I utilize something else, let's try that out. Let's see. And this is definitely in the experimental phase. We don't we don't necessarily have to worry about this. Let's see what happens if I turn this into a VarChar. Okay. I apologize, everyone, making sure that I can find my file correctly. All right, so it goes into SQL, and then after that, I want to grab students.sql. Oh, and I forgot to dash I at the beginning of this. Okay, so I was able to grab the information, I think. Oh, that I forgot to. Yep, I did. There we go. Okay, so I dropped the table, created the table. All right, let's see what happens when I run this again. Yeah, that was good. Thank you. I appreciate that, Kara. That's a good clarification. So just to clarify, that padding came from the database itself because I utilized character rather than utilizing varchar. By utilizing varchar, it only occupied the space necessary. And when that string came back, this time when I sent my request, it actually came back only occupying the space necessary instead of having that extra padding at the end of the characters. Thanks so much, Kara. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Michael and I ran into that yesterday, so.
Oh, awesome. All right. Any other questions? Oh, and I see Michael just shared the link to that information as well. Okay, I see a question right here on the right hand on the chat from Natalie. Then you comment out the table of students information in the SQL document. I did in the SQL document, but I'm not talking to the SQL document when I'm running my server. That SQL document is only executed every time I run the /I. After that, after the SQL document gets executed, everything in the database stays the same. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Oh, and DJ shared one as well. Awesome. All right. Any other questions regarding the material that we covered today? Okay, perfect. If there aren't any other questions, today we covered the full stack development process. We went over a real life example of the of an API. We went over installing Flask, creating a return all students function. Then after that, we created a Flask server. We ran that server and we turned that return all students function into a route that would respond whenever an API route was triggered. So now that function would only return the JSON objects responding to that route. Then we talked about connecting Postgres to our SQL server. We covered a small introduction to Psycopg, but we'll learn more about it later on. We went into creating a student class model. We talked about Python queries, formatting our query set, and lastly, we talked about how JSONify turns our query set into a response. Are there any questions regarding any of these topics that were taught today? All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.